Single mother ridiculed at school assembly until millionaire steps up and defends her son in front of everyone. The school auditorium was packed with well-dressed fathers, elegant mothers, and attentive teachers. In the center, a young, simple mother held her son's hand, who was staring at the floor with teary eyes. The principal, with a smile disguised as formality, had just loudly explained that the boy had arrived without any supplies, prompting muffled laughter and looks of contempt from the other parents. One of the most influential mothers in town, wearing an expensive dress and an arrogant look, stood up to comment venomously, maybe if his mother worked more and showed up less, he'd have a decent notebook. The laughter that followed was cruel. The woman felt her face burn, but she didn't let go of her son's hand, even when he tried to pull away in embarrassment. The painful silence that followed only reinforced the feeling that, in front of everyone, she had been reduced to nothing. It was then that the auditorium doors burst open. A tall man with a firm posture and a presence that commanded the room entered without asking permission. He was dressed in an impeccable suit, but his eyes were fixed solely on the boy huddled in the corner. The principal tried to interrupt, but his voice cut through the air like a blade. "Who here dares laugh at a child for not having a notebook?" The silence fell like a weight. No one responded. He approached, took a luxurious pen from his pocket, and placed it on the table in front of the boy, saying, "With this pen you will write your story, and I will ensure that it is greater than the contempt they tried to heap upon you." Only then did everyone realize who this man was. The millionaire who financed half the city's projects, the man whose presence was enough to silence anyone. The Lincoln Elementary Auditorium had that typical smell of antique wood mixed with the expensive perfume of local high society mothers. The chairs were lined up in rows, and on the stage the principal adjusted the papers with the posture of someone who knew she had everyone's attention. In the front row, women dressed in expensive dresses and high heels looked down, as if the meeting were less about education and more about status. Among them stood Victoria, the wife of one of the city's most influential businessmen, always ready to deliver venom with polite words. And in the middle of this scene, almost invisible, stood Sarah, young single mother in her early 20s, her hands firmly on the shoulders of her 8-year-old son. The shy boy seemed to shrink under the slanted glances. Sarah's clothes were unremarkable, a simple blouse, worn jeans, and hastily tied hair. But her eyes betrayed sleepless nights and struggles no one there cared to know about. The whispered conversations weren't subtle. "Look, that's the mother who never shows up to school parties," one whispered. "She doesn't have a husband, and she sends her son without any supplies. How embarrassing," another replied. Each comment was a blade that cut deep. Sarah pretended not to hear, keeping her head high, but inside, her heart pounded. On stage, the principal called everyone's attention and announced that some students hadn't brought the necessary supplies, mentioning her son's name aloud. It was like a gunshot. The boy bit his lower lip, holding back tears, and Sarah felt her world fall apart. Giggles echoed. Some parents shook their heads in disapproval, and Victoria didn't miss the opportunity. Maybe if some mothers worked more instead of living off the school, these kids wouldn't be so embarrassed. A burst of laughter rippled through the auditorium. Sarah took a deep breath, squeezed her son's hand, and fought back the tears stinging her eyes. She knew she couldn't argue back. Any word would be used as ammunition against her. The silence that followed wasn't one of respect, but of judgment. A heavy, suffocating silence that forced her against the wall in front of everyone. And it was at that moment that the atmosphere changed, not by her words, nor by her tears, but by something no one expected. Sarah had never had an easy life. Born in a Detroit suburb, she grew up in a house where the winter cold crept in through the cracks in the windows, and food was never enough. Her father, a factory worker, abandoned the family when she was just 9, leaving behind an overworked mother drowning in double shifts and fatigue. Sarah learned early to care for her younger brother, trading dolls for pots and pans, schoolwork for sleepless nights rocking a feverish baby. Childhood slipped away through tiny fingers that could never hold dreams. At 17, she fell in love with an older boy who promised her the world. He said he would take her away from that life, that he would make her special, but reality set in quickly and brutally. He disappeared soon after discovering she was pregnant. Without a diploma, without support, and with a baby in her arms, Sarah experienced the bitter taste of prejudice. At the hospital, nurses treated her as if she were just another statistic. In the neighborhood, judgmental looks burned more than the winter cold. Still, she never gave up. She worked as a supermarket cashier, cleaned offices in the wee hours of the morning, and took any job that would earn her a few dollars to buy diapers, milk, and later, notebooks for her son. Every penny counted. The rent was late. The refrigerator was always empty, and the fear of not being able to survive was a constant visitor. Still, there was something about Sarah that others didn't see. A quiet strength, shaped by pain. She didn't let the voices that told her she couldn't make it get her down. She knew that each humiliation she faced was another brick in the wall of resistance she built around herself and her son. Little Daniel became her only reason to get out of bed when everything seemed to be falling apart. Looking into his eyes was a reminder that there was still something pure in the world, something worth the sacrifice. Sarah faced nights of hunger to ensure he had enough to eat. She endured exhausting days so he could have at least a pair of sneakers for school. While other mothers discussed trips and vacation plans, she was calculating the electricity bill. While other women her age talked about parties, Sarah learned to hide in the bathroom, to cry without her son seeing her. The weight of loneliness, abandonment, and poverty became invisible scars, but also a stubborn flame that never went out. To every look of contempt, she responded with silence and perseverance. To every closed door, she insisted on knocking on another. Sarah carried within her a conviction that no one could steal. Her son's future would be different no matter what. That morning, Sarah had woken earlier than usual. She'd been folding clothes late into the night during an extra shift at the laundry room, but even exhausted, she made sure to make her son's coffee, pack his makeshift lunchbox, and straighten his slightly worn but clean uniform. Daniel anxiously held a drawing he'd done, a school project about dreams and the future. He didn't have the new notebook the teacher had requested, but he'd drawn on loose-leaf paper, believing the effort would be enough. Sarah knew better. She knew because she'd heard the whispers of other mothers, the cruel comparisons circulating between wealthy and influential parents. That night's school assembly wouldn't just be about education, but about status. She could feel it in the air. The principal, pressured by some powerful parents, had decided to expose the students who weren't meeting the basic requirements. For some, it was an encouragement. For Sarah and her son, it would be nothing more than a humiliation. Victoria, the influential mother, had made a sort of silent bet with the other women in the social group. It would be fun to see who would be the next mother embarrassed in front of everyone. She had already chosen her target. Sarah was perfect, too young, too poor, without a husband, and with a son who, according to rumors, hindered the class's performance. Ultimately, it wasn't about education, but about keeping the hierarchies intact. Victoria liked to be seen as the queen of the place, and public humiliation was her way of making it clear who was in charge. The auditorium had been prepared as a stage for this. The principal, consciously or not, joined in. When she read aloud Daniel's name among the students who hadn't brought their materials, the bet was won. Muffled laughter rippled through the room, and Victoria wasted no time in unleashing her venomous remark about mothers who don't work properly. The others glanced at each other, complicit in the cruelty. It was as if Sarah had been thrust into the center of an arena, with everyone waiting for the spectacle of embarrassment. Daniel, embarrassed, tightened his grip on his mother's hand, trying to disappear into it. Sarah felt her heart crush, but she didn't react. She knew the dynamics. If she raised her voice, defended herself, she would be labeled unbalanced. If she cried, they would say she confirmed her role as victim. All she had left was silence and the dignity of not letting go of her son's hand, even while she was the target of stares and laughter. The humiliation wasn't just the lack of a notebook, but the collective judgment that reduced her entire life to a stigma. It was at that moment that something bigger began to move, still invisible, but ready to break the cruel game they had played against her. Silence still hung heavy in the auditorium when the doors opened. The creaking sound echoed off the walls and all eyes turned back. The man who entered seemed out of place, not for lack of it, but for excess. Too much presence, too much imposing, too much silent authority. The well-cut suit, the steady gaze, the sure-footed steps across the hardwood floor. It was Ethan Collins, a name that circulated in the city newspapers, known for million-dollar donations and investments that supported half of the social programs and, ironically, part of the school itself. No one expected his presence at a regular meeting, but there he was, breaking the logic of planned humiliation. Sarah didn't know him personally, only from hearsay, but she could tell his attention wasn't on the stage or the influential mothers, but on Daniel, who was still cowering, biting his lip, trying to hold back tears. Sarah's heart raced in confusion. Ethan approached slowly, ignoring the whispers and the surprise evident on the faces of those present. The principal tried to intervene, choking on formalities. "Mr. Collins, what an honor to welcome you, but we didn't know you were coming." He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the boy and the woman shielding him with her body. Sarah nervously squeezed her son's hand, trying to guess what would come next. And then the first contact happened. Ethan's eyes met hers. There was no judgment, no contempt, just a direct, firm, almost protective gaze. Sarah felt as if the ground had disappeared for a moment. She was used to looks that diminished her, that measured her by what she didn't have. But this one was different, as if it pierced her insides and saw something no one else cared to see. Ethan crouched down in front of the boy, reaching eye level, and asked in a calm yet authoritative voice, "Is it true you were shamed for not having a notebook?" Daniel hesitated, looked at his mother, and replied in a whisper, "Yes, sir." The room fell silent. Ethan then opened his jacket pocket and took out a gold metal pen, placing it delicately on the table in front of the boy. "It's not a notebook, but it's enough for you to start writing your story, and no one here has the right to say it's worth less." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. The gesture wasn't about wealth, it was about dignity. For the first time in a long time, someone was standing up for her and her son. That was the first time their paths crossed, but it would only be the beginning of a story marked by shocks, revelations, and scars exposed under the merciless light of truth. Ethan's gesture had interrupted the natural flow of humiliation, but it hadn't eliminated it. On the contrary, it seemed to have lit a flame of resistance in the venomous gazes of those mothers accustomed to dominating the room. Victoria, sitting in her front row seat, crossed her legs ostentatiously and let out a laugh laden with irony. "What a beautiful scene," she said aloud, drawing out the syllables for all to hear. "A gold pen won't change the fact that some people simply don't belong." The room reacted with murmurs, and the venom spread like a silent wave. Sarah tightened her grip on her son's hand, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew she couldn't react, that any word would be distorted, but shame suffocated her. Daniel, cowering, lowered his head, as if wishing to disappear. The principal, instead of intervening, pretended not to hear, adjusting papers on the lectern with concealed nervousness. It was clear, no one dared confront Victoria. The contempt wasn't just in her words, but in the knowing looks surrounding her. Women whispered to each other, some chuckled softly, others cast looks of pity mixed with judgment. It was as if they were saying without words, "She'll never be one of us." Ethan, however, remained silent. His steady gaze swept the room as if recording every face, every expression. Sarah, for her part, felt small, crushed by the weight of the collective laughter. The humiliation wasn't just public, it was meticulously constructed, like a play in which she'd been cast as the defeated one. Victoria then delivered the final blow, rising with the confidence of someone who knew she was untouchable. "It's not fair that our children work hard and bring everything right while others, coming from who knows where, are defended only by charity. This school is no place for handouts." The silence that followed was even crueler than the laughter. Sarah felt her legs tremble, but she didn't cry. She held her son's arm tightly, lifted her face, and stared into space, refusing to bow before the audience. But inside, something was breaking. something that had been wounded so many times before and was now exposed for all to see. The public. Humiliation was complete, and Sarah would never forget the bitter taste of that moment. What she didn't know was that behind Ethan's silence, something was beginning to stir, a storm about to change the fate of everyone there. Sarah walked out of the auditorium with her son by the hand, trying to hurry her steps so no one would notice the trembling in her legs. The cold Michigan night wind blew against her face, mingling with the heat of the tears she refused to let fall in public. Daniel, silent, clutched the drawing he had brought to the meeting to his chest, now crumpled by the tension of the moment. That was when she heard footsteps behind her. Ethan was catching up with her, still impeccable, still with that look that seemed to see beyond appearances. "Wait," he said, his voice low but firm. Sarah stopped, turned slowly, trying to control her breathing. She didn't want to show weakness, not in front of someone like him. "I'm sorry for what happened in there," Ethan continued. "No one should be treated that way." For a moment silence settled between them. Sarah then lifted her chin and something in her gaze changed. She wasn't the same embarrassed woman from minutes ago. There was a quiet, almost defiant strength. "I knew it would be like this," she replied, her voice firm even if choked with pain. "From the moment I walked into that room, I knew my son would be used as a spectacle. Victoria and the other mothers make a game of it, and the principal allows it. I just endured it." Ethan frowned in surprise. Sarah continued, "Do you think this was the first time?" "No, I know how they work. They bet on who will be humiliated at the next meeting. And this time, it was us. I expected it. And you know what? I agreed to come anyway because I want my son to learn that his worth doesn't depend on what they say. He needs to see that I can endure it for him." Her words fell like stones in the silence of the street. Ethan was speechless for a few seconds. He hadn't expected to find in this young mother not only resistance but full awareness of the cruel game society was playing against her. Sarah knew everything, endured every blow not out of ignorance, but by choice. She had chosen to be a shield for her son, even if it meant being a target. "They can laugh, they can despise me," she said, calmer now, almost as if speaking to herself. "But they don't know where I came from, or everything I've faced, and deep down they don't know what I know about them." Those last words intrigued Ethan. There was something in her tone, a hidden layer, as if she carried secrets no one there imagined. Sarah didn't just survive humiliations, she anticipated them, knew them by heart, and used them as proof of her own resilience. The cruel game they thought they were playing wasn't so invisible after all, and for the first time, Ethan felt that perhaps he wasn't the observer of this story, but rather someone about to discover that he was facing a truth greater than he could have imagined. Ethan couldn't get Sarah out of his mind that night. The scene in the auditorium haunted him, but what intrigued him most was the way she'd looked at him when she'd told him she knew everything. That wasn't the expression of a common victim, but of someone carrying secrets. In the days that followed, he discreetly inquired about her. As the school's largest donor, it wasn't difficult to obtain basic records: full name, simple address in a modest neighborhood, history of temporary work. But something caught his eye: Sarah Donovan. The surname sounded familiar more than he cared to admit. A distant memory began to surface. He asked his assistant to pull up old files, and when the report arrived, the shock was inevitable. Her father, Patrick Donovan, had worked for decades at the factory that had served as the basis of his own family's initial fortune. Patrick had been one of the most self-sacrificing men, known for volunteering for the heaviest shifts, for never missing work until the day he suffered a serious accident on the production line. The case was hushed up. The Collins family, concerned with protecting their corporate image, had offered paltry compensation and abandoned him. Patrick became disabled and shortly thereafter disappeared, leaving his wife and children to the mercy of poverty. Sarah was this man's daughter. Ethan felt his stomach churn. Suddenly, her gaze, filled with silence and resistance, took on new meaning. She wasn't just a single mother in poverty. She was the direct product of the failings of an empire he represented. The public scorn he'd suffered that night at school was nothing compared to the silent wound he'd carried since childhood. He remembered seeing Patrick Donovan as a child, still in the heyday of the factory, a man with calloused hands who smiled proudly when he spoke of his children. Now he understood. Patrick's downfall and Sarah's poverty were linked to the Collins family's own success. He sat silently, staring at the file on his desk. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he owned nothing. The power, the wealth, the public acclaim. Everything seemed fragile in the face of the realization that this woman's suffering mirrored the injustice her family had helped perpetuate. And it was in this heavy silence that a truth sank in. Sarah knew everything. She not only endured the humiliations because she was strong, but because she already carried the weight of a buried past, a secret that, if revealed, could forever tarnish the Collins name. In the following days, Sarah seemed to have disappeared from the face of the earth. She was no longer seen at school, she didn't appear on the usual neighborhood streets, and when people asked about her, the answers were vague. Some said she was working double shifts, others claimed she had moved closer to her ailing mother. The truth was, Sarah, after that encounter, decided to withdraw. She no longer wanted to be the target of cruel bets, nor to be remembered only as the mother who was defended by the millionaire. She needed silence, space to protect her son from the weight of those gazes. Ethan, on the other hand, began to feel her absence in an unexpected way. I was used to board meetings, gala dinners, and million-dollar contracts, but suddenly none of these commitments had the same force. Between meetings, his mind returned to the image of Sarah leaving the auditorium with her head held high, holding her son tightly, as if the whole world were a battle to be faced with dignity. The void she had left began to unsettle him. With each report he signed, with each new investment announced, he felt something essential slipping away. For the first time, he realized that all the power he wielded couldn't fill the silence left by a simple woman, whose presence he'd only experienced for a few minutes, but who had left an impression on him like no other. She discreetly sent people to look for her, but Sarah seemed to have become invisible. She avoided the same places, changed routines, declined school invitations. It was as if he'd decided to disappear from the radar, and the further she retreated, the more Ethan missed her. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a visceral need to understand why her gaze shook him so, why her silence weighed more than 1,000 words. At luxurious dinners, he found himself remembering Sarah's firm gaze when she told him she knew everything. In the silence of his office, the memory of her strength overshadowed any negotiation, and as he lay alone in his penthouse, the image of the boy Daniel clutching the drawing to his chest haunted him like a ghost. Sarah's absence wasn't just physical, it was a mirror reflecting all the gaps in his life, all the emptiness money had never filled. And so, little by little, her absence transformed into something greater, a search that would not be interrupted, because, without realizing it, Ethan was beginning to discover that he was no longer in control of his own story. Ethan's prestige had always been unshakable, a respected businessman, an applauded philanthropist, a prominent presence in society columns. But Sarah's absence, coupled with the weight of the past he had uncovered, began to affect his own actions. At a public meeting weeks later, while speaking about investments in the city, a voice from the audience rose. "What about the families ruined by the Collins plant? You talk about the future, but you forget the wreckage of the past." Silence fell like thunder. Local newspapers, which had always extolled his achievements, began investigating. Soon, headlines surfaced, recalling hush-hush workplace accidents, abandoned employees, and stories of poverty that contrasted with the family fortune. Old photos of Patrick Donovan resurfaced, and with them Sarah's name, connecting past and present in a thread of pain. What had once been reverence turned to doubt. At social events, the looks were no longer of admiration but of judgment. Business people whispered in the hallways, investors questioned his image. On social media, comments abounded. Hero or executioner? Millionaire who built an empire on suffering? The downfall came not with shouts, but with the corrosive silence of public opinion. Ethan, accustomed to controlling narratives, felt exposed. The Collins name, which had previously opened doors, now drew questions. And all this because of a buried truth that now resurfaced. laden with echoes that could no longer be ignored. He began to feel the weight of collective contempt, the same that Sarah had felt in the auditorium, only now multiplied, reflected back at him on a larger scale. No amount of wealth could silence the invisible justice of time. Social judgment enveloped him like a court without judges, where every disapproving look was a sentence, and every silence a condemnation. For the first time in years, Ethan Collins was not untouchable. Ethan had always believed that power lay in the ability to shape the world around him with money and influence. But when the newspapers began exposing his family's past and society's gaze turned against him, something broke inside. For the first time, he experienced the weight of shame. Not the superficial kind, but the kind that corrodes the soul. He sat before the penthouse mirror and no longer recognized the man he saw reflected back. The impeccable suit seemed like empty armor, and the luxurious house, desert of silence. Nights grew long. Sleep eluded him, and in its place came memories, the face of Sarah's father, Patrick Donovan, laughing with his factory colleagues, calloused hands raised proudly. Sarah's gaze in the auditorium, unwavering despite the humiliation. The crumpled drawing Daniel held to his chest. Each memory was an accusation, a reminder that his wealth was built on stories of pain he had never chosen to see. Ethan began avoiding parties, declining invitations, cancelling business meetings. Instead of toasts and speeches, he sought silence. He spent hours walking the city's less favored streets, trying to see up close what he had always ignored behind the tinted windows of his cars. He saw mothers like Sarah, tired men returning from work, children playing barefoot but laughing with a freedom he had never known. It was in this reality check that the transformation began. He stopped looking for ways to cleanse his image for others and began seeking ways to cleanse his own conscience. He understood that the true failure lay not in losing contracts or prestige, but in never recognizing the human value of those who had always sustained his empire. For the first time, he felt empathy, not as a speech, but as real pain, like an open wound. And within this process, a need grew to find Sarah, not to justify himself, nor to erase mistakes, but because she was the living link between his past and a possible different future. Her silent strength had become his mirror, and without that reflection he could no longer rebuild himself. The reunion happened unexpectedly, in a place no one could have predicted. Ethan was at a neighborhood community center, one of those small spaces supported by donations and volunteer efforts, where children received tutoring and families found some support. He had been invited to a discreet meeting with the coordinators, a belated attempt to connect with the reality he had previously ignored. When he entered the simple room with its peeling walls and the smell of old paint, his heart stopped for a moment. There was Sarah leaning over a table, helping a group of children with math problems. Her hair was tied up unpretentiously, her clothes simple, but her eyes, they were the same steady eyes that had stared at him in the auditorium, filled with an inextinguishable light. Ethan stood in the doorway, as if the world had frozen. Sarah looked up and saw him. The silence that fell at that moment seemed more deafening than any scream. The past came flooding back, the auditorium, the laughter, the contempt, and also the secret that bound them together, unbeknownst to the others. Daniel, now more confident, ran to his mother to show her the drawing he was making, and only then did he notice the man standing there. The boy hesitated, but then smiled shyly, as if recognizing a distant protector. Sarah, however, didn't smile. She stood slowly, lifting her face with that quiet dignity that always accompanied her. Ethan took a few steps, but stopped, as if afraid to break the invisible barrier between them. "You disappeared," he said, his voice low, almost a confession. Sarah took a deep breath. "I didn't disappear. I just went where I've always been, among my own. It's not me who lives outside my place, Ethan. It's you who've never truly looked at this world." The words cut deeper than any accusation. There was no explicit rancor, but a painful truth he couldn't deny. Their reunion wasn't filled with hugs or tears, but with a heavy silence, with gazes that held more stories than words could explain. In that moment, Ethan realized there was no longer enough distance, nor wealth, that could keep him away from that woman and the mirror she represented. Fate had brought them face to face again, not by chance but as an inevitable reckoning in life, where old scores and silences finally needed to be faced. The reunion didn't bring immediate answers, but it opened old wounds. The days that followed, Ethan approached the community center more often, offering help, donations, and presents. But Sarah kept her distance. She accepted the resources because she knew they would benefit children in need, but she never accepted closeness. Her silence was the highest barrier he'd ever faced, harder to overcome than any million-dollar negotiation. Until, one autumn afternoon, the two of them were alone in the center's courtyard, while Daniel ran with other children. The wind blew dry leaves across the ground, and the grey sky seemed to weigh down on them. Ethan took a deep breath and said what he'd been holding back. "I discovered who you are. I know what happened to your father, and I know my family was responsible for much of what you suffered." Sarah looked at him, and there was no surprise in that look, only confirmation that she'd always known he would come to this conclusion. "And what do you want me to do with that?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I want to make amends. I want you to give me the chance to fix at least a part of what was destroyed." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if holding back an old pain. When she opened them, there were unshed tears, but also an unbreakable strength. "You can't give back the childhood I lost. You can't give back the dignity they stripped from my father when he was treated as disposable. You can't erase the sleepless nights I spent trying to give my son what was owed to. The system you helped destroy." Ethan lowered his head, feeling the weight of each word. Sarah took a step closer, and her voice, though low, cut like a blade. "But you can choose not to repeat this. Not with me, not with my son, not with anyone else." The silence that followed was heavy. He wanted to apologize, but knew it wasn't enough. She, in turn, offered no redemptive ending, only a clear choice. "I won't hate you, Ethan," she said finally, "but I'm also not going to waste myself trying to save someone who always had the power to change everything and never did. I'll follow my path. You follow yours. If you've truly learned something, prove it to the world, not to me." And so, with that decision, Sarah sealed their fate. There was no hug, no promise of a new beginning. There was only the dignity of a woman who chose not to live in the shadow of the past, and the silent pain of a man who understood that, for the first time, he was not the one who had the final say. Snow was beginning to fall lightly over the city when Ethan left the community center that night. He walked alone along the sidewalk, the icy breeze pelting his face, each step heavy as if carrying invisible stones. High above the buildings, lights flickered, reflecting off the white layer forming on the ground. In the distance, the sound of children still echoed, soft laughter piercing the cold like live coals. He stopped for a moment and looked back. Inside the simple iron gate, he saw Daniel running to his mother, hugging her tightly. Sarah, even tired, knelt to embrace him, smiling that small but genuine smile. Ethan remained motionless, watching. He didn't try to approach, didn't call her name. He simply stood there, a spectator of a life that didn't belong to him. The streetlights flickered on in succession, casting long shadows across the asphalt. A snowflake landed on his hand, melting almost instantly, and he closed his fist around it, as if holding on to something already crumbling. Then he turned and continued walking, his figure diminishing as he walked away, swallowed by the night. Inside the gate, Sarah looked up briefly, as if she knew he was still nearby, but said nothing. She simply clutched her son to her chest, while the wind carried away the echo of the silence that united such different destinies. The sound of the city around them seemed distant. All that remained was the image of a mother and son, protected by each other, and of a man walking alone through the snow, condemned to the weight of his choices. The imaginary camera lifts to the sky, showing the city covered in white, while the lights shine like earthly constellations. Life goes on, but the emptiness remains, invisible, profound, inescapable. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below. I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing. On your screen, I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.